This morning, police were handing out masks to commuters in Madrid as Spain began to ease its lockdown. But there weren't many commuters, with most workplaces, shops and bars still on course to be shut for another 2 weeks. Though construction and manufacturing have been allowed to resume, this is a tentative first step, with many Spaniards apparently still preferring confinement to the risk of more contagion, even if they've been cooped up at home for a month already. That's because of scenes like this: nurses mourning a colleague who died of the virus on the pandemic's front line. After over 17,000 deaths in Spain, there's a debate over whether the virus could return with a vengeance if restrictions are lifted too quickly. The Prime Minister trying to balance the needs of an economy more stricken than at any time since the 1930s with the threat to life.
The response requires combining measures that prevent contagion, that allow the recovery of our health system, and that at the same time prevent paralysis and the collapse of our economy with the harmful effects it may have on employment in our country.
But from China, a warning. Even as the lockdown continues to ease in Wuhan province, the epicenter of this global disaster, more than 100 new coronavirus cases were reported in China overnight, the biggest spike in daily numbers in well over a month. None of them in Wuhan itself, with most of them Chinese nationals returning from Russia, which goes to show that for all the precautions, when you think it might be over, it's not quite. In Italy, where the death toll today topped 20,000, police stepped up patrols over the Easter weekend. On Saturday, more than 250,000 people were asked to explain why they weren't at home, with over 12,000 of them fined in the last few days. Even as the Pope, who gave a blessing from a balcony of his private apartments, warned that women around the world were at increased risk of domestic violence. The beaches at the nearby holiday resort of Ostia were almost deserted, as was the Duomo Cathedral in Milan, where the singer Andrea Bocelli sang in front of a piazza from which even the pigeons appeared to have fled. I once was lost. Easter was a badly needed symbol of rebirth, he said, whether you were Christian or not.
Well, as the lockdown looks set to continue for some weeks, ministers are also weighing up the vast cost to the economy as the country's businesses remain in limbo. Our business and global trade correspondent Paul McNamara is outside the Treasury. Paul.
Yeah, well, look, you don't have to be an economist to work out the economy's grinding to a halt. Just look outside the window of the home you're not allowed to leave. The question is, though, just how bad is this slowdown? The Treasury have been a bit cagey about that, but tonight one source in there pointed us towards some research that said the economy could shrink by as much as 30% over the 3 months from April through to June. Look, that's huge. To put that into context, in the 3 months after the global financial crisis in 2008, GDP only fell by 2.2%. We've never seen anything like this in our lifetimes. So the question is, just what are they going to do to get the economy back onto its feet? At the moment, the focus is just on keeping it alive. Much as that has been through these emergency loans to businesses. But today we found out some figures about these loans to businesses, and there's a growing frustration that not enough of them have been handed out quick enough. So far, 20,000 applications have been made. Of those, only 4,200 have been handed out. We spoke to the boss of the London Chamber of Commerce today. He blames the banks, saying they've, quote, lost touch with the basic economy of the country. The banks are saying they're working as fast as they can to deal with as many of these applications as they can. The Treasury pointed us towards figures saying the number of loans has been increased 8-fold over the last week. But clearly, more needs to be done to get these loans out the door quickly if we're not to see a whole load of firms go bust.
Paul McNamara. Now, earlier I spoke to the Nobel Prize-winning economist and former advisor to the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz. He has a new book out called People, Power and Profits. I began by asking him what he thought of President Trump's talk of getting America back to work as early as May.
This is an area where the United States is not setting a good leadership. It should be clear to everybody that unless the pandemic is put under control, it will not be possible to get the global economy going. Obviously, the United States is a big consumer of goods from all over the world. If our economy is on hold, it has important consequences for everybody else. But the reality is the global economy is going to be in a fragile state until the global pandemic is really addressed.
Can I ask you what may sound like a rather cruel question, and that is, all our lives we've looked to American leadership, to get us through war, to get us through pestilence, the lot. Should Britain any longer look to America for leadership?
Well, hopefully in the future it will be able to, but we're at a moment where the result of the peculiar electoral processes in the United States, somebody who did not get a majority of vote in the 2016 election became the president. And unfortunately, he's been tested by the pandemic and he's failed that test. So I think what it emphasizes is that the rest of the world has to develop strong leadership. And going forward, it can't just rely on the United States. This is a time where government has to step up. The problem with the last 40 years, beginning with Reagan and Thatcher in the UK, was the role of the government was denigrated in such a way as to undermine the ability of the government to respond precisely in an emergency like this. And that's why countries like the United States and where it's been denigrated the most have not done as good a job as countries like South Korea.
Professor Stiglitz, we've talked very much from the perspective of the rich North, but what are the implications of what has happened? What's going to happen to people in the developing world, particularly in the very poor and deprived areas?
I'm very worried. In the developing countries, health conditions are worse. They're much more densely packed together. Social distancing is much more difficult. And their economic resources are obviously much more limited. That's why it is so worrisome. But it should be worrisome even for the developed countries because we live in a very interconnected world. And I don't believe that there's any way of protecting us if we don't contain the pandemic in the developing countries and emerging markets. And that's why I think it's absolutely imperative that there be a massive program of assistance to the developing countries and emerging markets.
But in the end, it seems, does it not, that we're headed for a new world order in which grotesque inequality is almost bound to be the order of the day?
I think we are. We're going to a new global order where a new geopolitics, a new globalization. I think we'll have more respect for science because it is science that will have saved us. Hopefully we'll have more respect for government because without collective action, where would we be? We all realize that each of us on our own could not have gotten us out of this predicament. And so I think it'll cause us, I think, to rethink many aspects of our market economy, but even more fundamentally, many aspects of the way we've organized our entire society.
Joseph Stiglitz, thank you very much indeed for talking with us.
Thank you.
Well, in the United States, New York remains the epicenter of the coronavirus crisis, with 10,000 people now having died. But a spike in cases is still predicted in other states, one of which is Florida. The governor there is a devoted supporter and friend of President Trump. Both are being criticized for a slow response to this outbreak. And as ever, in an election year in Florida, one eye is always on politics. Kate Fisher has this report.
The administration did not get adequate personal protective equipment for medical professionals.
Potentially reuse masks is something we have never had to do.
I felt like I was working in a war.
America may be fighting a pandemic, but it's still in the middle of a political battle too.
The coronavirus.
This is their new hoax.
Democrat supporting ads are now being deployed across the battleground states, attacking Donald Trump over his response to the coronavirus. Crucial to November's election will be Florida. Its case numbers have been steadily rising for weeks, but it remained largely open until April the 1st, when the state governor Ron DeSantis finally ordered a lockdown. A spike in deaths is predicted by early May.
Build the wall.
He reads stories.
Then Mr. Trump said, "You're fired."
Often described as a mini Trump, Governor DeSantis' gushing admiration for the president has reached self-parody. Now he's being accused of following his friend's lead on coronavirus.
Ron DeSantis for governor.
I think it's an utter travesty. Governor Ron DeSantis completely bungled this. Here in Florida, unfortunately, we have a high percentage of elderly, very high-risk people. And unfortunately, he waited way, way, way too long. And we know for a fact that when you're in the midst of a rapidly moving pandemic with this highly contagious, deadly virus, it's like a snowball going downhill. So the later you act, people die.
While many hard-hit states have complained of a lack of emergency medical supplies, Florida reportedly got everything it initially asked for from the White House. Officials say supply is assessed by need, but many Democrats, including Dr. Grayson, suspect the president is playing favorites.
That stinks. It definitely, when you see blue states that are hurting and screaming for help, and yet here's good old Florida and Trump's buddy down here, and they say, yeah, we need a little bit of stuff, and Trump's like, yeah, that stinks of political favoritism, and we're in an era where such political favoritism potentially can cost human lives.
Florida is officially Donald Trump's home state, though polls suggest 58% of Floridians don't trust him to provide reliable information on coronavirus. The state is notoriously unpredictable politically, but he still has plenty of support here, particularly among its millions of older residents.
I think he's doing an excellent job. I mean, none of us, the president, the governor, all the governors, this has never happened before. How can you blame somebody for it? You should have. I mean, I could do that every Monday morning of my football team. If they lose, I start telling them how they could have won.
A crowd in uncomfortably close quarters shoved its way forward.
For many newly unemployed and scared of falling ill, the election is the last thing on their minds. Hundreds had to risk their health this week to queue in person for unemployment benefits after the state's online system crashed under the demand. At least 500,000 have lost their jobs here. Florida played a huge role in Donald Trump's victory in 2016.
This is the Trump train, baby. Everybody's jumping on the Trump train.
But the longer Floridians stay indoors and out of work, the harder it will be for the president to persuade them to ride again. And come November, how Florida votes could decide how America votes.